much for taking the time out of your day to come join us. Welcome to the Press Under Pressure in Texas webinar. My name is Trisha Panicker, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Prosper High School newspaper, Eagle Nation Online, and the club development officer for New Voices Texas. We are so excited that you're here for the grand finale of the Scholastic Journalism Week 2026.
And I'm Zara Bukhari, news editor for the Three Penny Press at Bellaire High School, and I'm also the legislative officer for New Voices Texas. Today is more than just celebrating student media, it's also about protecting it. In Texas, student journalists often face prior review and censorship that wouldn't be allowed in the professional world. Today, we're going to talk about why we need a state law to change that.
And so we have an incredible panel of experts and advocates joining us today. And let me introduce them. First, we have Andrea Negri. She is the Student Publication Advisor at Cypress Woods High School and serves as the Director of the Journalism Education Association's Scholastic Press Rights Committee. She is a tireless advocate for teachers and student rights. Next, we have Cameron Samuels, the Executive Director of SEAT, Students Engaged in Advancing Texas. SEAT is a vital ally to student journalists, focusing on protecting the broader rights of students across our state. And joining us from the national level is Grayson Marlowe, the Advocacy Associate for the Student Press Law Center. Grayson helps us coordinate New Texas movements all over the country, helping students turn stories into legislation. And then finally, we have Pooja Sai Kona. Pooja Sai is the Managing Director of the Raccoon Rambler at Frisco High School. She also serves as the state organizing officer for New Voices Texas, where she builds partnerships that keep our movement growing.
And we just want to thank you all for being here, and let's get started with our first round of questions.
And so, Andrea, let's start with you. As a director for GEA, what are the most common red flags you see when an administration is beginning to overstep its bounds, and how does prior review hurt the educational goal of teaching journalism?
Let's see. So one of the things that I commonly see as part of the SPRC is just outright banning certain topics. Administrators saying something like, you can't cover controversial topics. And I just want to get ahead of that by saying that actually doesn't even fall under Hazelwood because you have to have written something to actually review before you could even consider whether there's an educational purpose. So that's one red flag right there. The second thing we see is just outright censorship without a reason. Both Tinker and Hazelwood call for having a purpose, not just a no. Something that I've previously experienced as an advisor is having a principal come in and say all interview requests, whether it's for another administrator or a teacher, have to run through me, because then they're controlling access to who you as a student journalist can interview, and maybe even having a chilling effect on those interview subjects. They feel like they can't say certain things. And then the last thing, red flag, I would say, is retaliation through other, means beyond just restricting content, such as cutting budgets or restricting access to things like trips to conventions that you've ordinarily been able to go on. I would say are some of the most common things that I've seen. As far as how does prior review hurt educational goals, I know it's not quite an equivalent, but one thing I always say is, if the band messes up at a performance, the principal doesn't come in the next day and say, I'm taking over the show and we're redoing it. Same thing if the football team, messes up, they're not calling the plays next week. So I feel like, for starters, it kind of shows a lack of trust in the advisor that they've selected. And even if they didn't hire that person, just a general mistrust of the people that are on that campus. The second thing is, banning something does not mean that students aren't going to talk about it or hear about it. One thing that I've seen is, especially now that we have so many different ways of publication, is often an administrator might try to block something for their school's audience, but then it, through it being published by professional media or even being published independently, now it's got a wider audience than it might have if it didn't have this censorship blow up in the first place. And then you also, as student journalists, you are supposed to be providing reliable information. And so when you censor something, you're actually preventing one way of maybe students getting correct information or balanced information versus if they go seek out those things independently.
And I just wanted to have a follow-up question of that. What topics have you seen banned? that your students cannot write?
Well, I mean, at my current school, we have a really great relationship with my principal, so I can't say we have anything at my current campus, but just speaking in general, I mean, let's face it, we're talking about Texas right now, so there are a lot of things that there's pushback on in other content areas, such as what books students can read and that sort of thing. And I've seen and heard from some students who feel like they can't even cover the controversies over what books are being removed from their district libraries or what the review process is. So that's one thing. I mean, anything that could be deemed critical of something happening at the school, I would say, is another common issue, whether it's, an editorial about not liking the new hall pass policy or something like that. So things that are critical of this school, and then, things that might make the school look bad. And again, just kind of going to that educational thing, I don't think, a professional journalist is sitting here going, I don't know if we should publish this because it might make the school look bad. That's not your primary purpose. It's telling the truth. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then, Grayson, from SPLC's national perspective, why is the Hazelwood standard so dangerous for high schoolers, and what is needed to build a successful New Voices movement in a state as large as Texas?
These are massive questions, but I'll try to answer them the best I can. Hazelwood has been absolutely horrible for high school students. For the past 38 years, students have had their reporting silenced for arbitrary and subjective reasons, often just based off of what scares or makes their administrator nervous. And this has really stifled student speech and led to a lot of reporting, vital reporting, not actually getting told. But perhaps worst of all, it's also leading students to self-censor out of fear of censorship. The students are not trying to think about what are important stories that are going to be told, but rather what's not going to get myself in trouble, or my peers in trouble, or my administrators, or my advisors in trouble. And they're really reducing the kind of content that they're able to produce. And it's been horrible, not only for that reporting, but also for the journalism education, as Andrea was saying, but it also is completely eroding the trust between students and their administrators. Student journalists are often the only ones with access to the things that are going on in their school communities, in their school hallways, and how students are feeling about it. And under Hazelwood, many of those stories currently go untold. And that's why we continue to fight for New Voices legislation. And as for what we can do to make it successful, coalitions are often only successful when there's students front and center of them, which is why it's amazing to see all of you on this webinar talking about this issue. And it's so inspiring to have things like this. So continue doing this amazing good work that you already are doing. But we also have to continue to look at Texas as a whole, right? It's such a unique state. It's one, massive, with a wide array of different political views, but it also is one of those unique states that only meets every other year. So Texas only meets in odd years, which makes it even harder to pass legislation. So the primary thing is continue to push for this in off years or at on years, but also talk about the messaging a little bit, right? This is not a left or right issue. This is a First Amendment issue. This is an education issue. And all student stories, all student voices deserve to be heard within the guardrails of New Voices. Because as we'll talk about a little bit, it's not that students can publish anything and everything they want. There's still some regulations. There's some exclusions. They're not going to publish always unprotected speech, but it is still important to hear those stories. New Voices is there to make students able to freely report things that are important to the school community and even beyond sometimes. Sometimes student journalists are the only ones covering their local news, as many local papers have been decimated over the years. And it's important to note that student journalists do not want to make their schools look bad. That's not their goal. Their goal is to make their schools better. And that is exactly the kind of message we need to continue to share. We're hoping for a really big push in 2027. Please stay in touch and connected to our New Voices Texas team. And as always, it's always helpful to have a little bit of luck on your side to get these things passed.
Definitely. And real quick before we move on, I just have two follow-up questions for you. My first being, if an administrator pulls or edits a story, what are the first few steps that a student journalist should take?
The first step you should take, or I will always say, is contact SPLC's hotline. We offer a free hotline that you can call anytime you have any question regarding media law, but especially if you're facing any sort of censorship. So even as your principal maybe wants to read something, you can always reach out to the hotline just to get clarification on what your rights actually are. Currently in Texas, obviously, they're going to look a little different under Hazelwood. Under New Voices, you'd have a lot more protections. But that's your first step, is just reach out to get some information to know what you should be doing, what you should be prepared for. I also encourage you to bring an extra person with you if they ever bring you in for a meeting, both so there can be someone else to corroborate what you're saying, but also so that way you don't feel as much pressure. A lot of what school administrators use is kind of fear tactics. They are pulling you out of your classroom, they're pulling you out of your newsroom, they're intimidating you, they're bringing in your school resource officer sometimes. And that can be very intimidating, especially if you are the only one in that meeting. So bring a friend or a parent, or if you can get your advisor, although I do usually suggest to leave your advisor out of it so that way they can also stay protected. And Andrea, did you have some suggested as well?
Well, I just wanted to say, one thing you talked about is the intimidation factor. Want to, just speaking from experience as an advisor at a previous campus before, also be aware divide and conquer is a strategy. And so if you've got a co-editor, it gets contentious, know what your guys are going to do if you get pulled in separately, because that is something I've seen before, especially if maybe somebody's a little bit more assertive than the other or something like that. And then I also recommend having another adult, especially if you've got a really supportive parent. And again, have a game plan for what happens if you're told, no, you can't have that parent. Because I've seen, I've not directly seen because I wasn't physically present for it, but heard about it as well. Just things that I encourage you to be aware of.
And then just to ask another question, Grayson, so what are the most common ways that you've seen school censorships show up today? And how can student journalists recognize when something crosses the line legally?
Some more complicated questions. I think Hazelwood really does not give a good precedent for what can and cannot be censored. It really is blanketly anything. I mean, the irony is the most censored topic is usually censorship itself. Students can't actually talk about the censorship they are facing. As Andrea suggested, the great irony is if they go out and publish it in their local newspaper, now that story is 10 times bigger. But I mean, anything. We've seen students unable to talk about gun regulation from either side, student mental health, teenage pregnancy, sexual assault or harassment, all of these things that are really, really important for students to even try to comprehend and start to learn about under the advice and help of their advisor, of course. But students are just not able to currently do that. These are things that they'll go into the world maybe not knowing as much about because we're not allowing student journalists to cover them in the ethical ways that they're taught to do so through journalism and through their advisor. Your second question was, what are the first steps you should take, or what was that again?
Yeah. And my second question was, how can student journalists recognize when something crosses the line legally?
Again, call the hotline. Talk to an actual attorney. They can give you a much better answer to that, especially in particulars, because every single case is going to be very different. But generally, if your administrator is coming in and starting to make content decisions for you, that is getting into censorship. Whether or not it crosses a legal line is a different question entirely, and largely depends on the state you are in, the past history of your newspaper. If it's, for example, run as kind of a public forum, you have different protections than if your newspaper is a little more insulated into the school. So again, reach out to the hotline, contact someone who can give you those answers of the nitty-gritty on your particulars. But anytime you are having administrators try to meet with you to talk about your story or to try to restrict your story in any way, you are getting into that censorship area, and you should reach out to someone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that answer. And so, Cameron, I want to turn to you now. So, SEAT works on a student bill of rights. How does student press freedom connect to other issues like book bans? And what's your advice for a student testifying before the Texas legislature?
Yeah, thank you so much. And this is an incredible conversation going here so far that really resonates with me because of my personal experiences. I lead an organization with students across Texas who are advocating in the legislature and at school boards, and we're seeking to shape systems and defend our rights, to know our rights. To defend our rights, we have to know our rights. And so that's what we're doing. And building up the skills, the transferable skills that we can use to change these systems and demonstrate the active engagement of students in policymaking, which is traditionally something that excludes us. And we were talking about administrators cracking down on speech and using that fear and intimidation. And this is actually something that I had experienced firsthand, but it ended up turning out in some completely different direction than they thought and that I thought it would be. I was able to defend my rights as someone advocating to distribute banned books, as our school district had come down and sought to remove books from our school libraries. And so I was called into my principal's office to discuss these different issues multiple times throughout my senior year of high school. I was 17 years old. And even before books, as books became this emerging issue, I was also advocating for the free access to internet resources, like the Trevor Project Suicide Prevention Lifeline. My school district was blocking LGBTQ websites. So this was viewpoint discrimination. It was very much on the content of these websites and resources. And just because something is banned doesn't mean that students aren't going to be talking about these things, right? These issues are our realities as students. Mental health, LGBTQ identity, and the diversity that is our reality, especially here in Texas. Where are students going to find resources to support themselves, to discover the world around them when censorship is centermost? We aren't going to get that from the academic lens. We aren't going to get that from resources by medical professionals and mental health resources like the Trevor Project. We get them from bullying and harassment by peers in our community, at school, right? We don't have the access to the real resources that can support us. And so that's a key issue. And so even though I was called into my principal's office, I told them that, okay, what you're saying, I understand you. But get this, I read the law, I know the law. And that opened up the door for conversation. And my principal was like, oh, well, the superintendent told me to meet with you. And the superintendent seems to be wrong. And now I am sort of this liaison between the two. And tomorrow you're coming back to my office because I'm going to have the superintendent in the room right here. That is what ended up happening, where we used law. I personally, but also peers around me, we reviewed laws so we could distribute banned books, that we could dismantle this internet filter. But even before then, this is related to student press because in my senior year of high school, as this was all going down, I was an editor of my student newspaper. And while there weren't really too many issues with our student press and free speech rights my senior year, there were several years before. Whenever I was a freshman, I was a member of my Pride Club, and the Pride Club was going to be featured in our yearbook. And our principal, the very same principal, had sought to remove that page from our yearbook. And so also very content-based. This ended up being something that drew controversy. And even SPLC was involved. Our advisor, which I wasn't part of the staff at that time, but the advisor at our school ended up resigning. And the club did not make it into the yearbook, unfortunately, nor did other non-curricular clubs, because that's how they covered their tracks from the legal rights to just remove any non-curricular club. So therefore, it could not be construed as viewpoint discrimination. Seeing that issue, and then years later, to really be an advocate for knowing that my principal had been involved in that, but shaping her perception of this and being able to use her as this liaison to the current issues that we were facing in our school district with book bans and internet censorship. I mean, it shows that people can change, but it also shows that we have to be part of doing that. And so with this advocacy, SEAT has been involved, I mean, since then, building these networks across different school districts in Texas. And that's because these are not just isolated to one school. We can learn from each other. We can be in a peer mentor network that we have created as part of SEAT, where we have different programs like our Advocacy Day statewide and our year-round fellowships, where we're building that leadership. We are suing Texas and school districts against Senate Bill 12, which is a state law that also undermines free speech and expression and will get steps in the way of what students can cover in their newspapers and in their yearbooks. It bans GSA clubs, bans clubs about race and ethnicity. SB 12 erases students' identities and our voices. And so all these issues are interconnected, as you're alluding to. I mean, it was never about books. It was never about a page in a yearbook. It was never about any of these sort of things. It was always about the people represented in these yearbooks, in these newspapers, in these stories. It was about writers and journalists, the people writing these stories, capturing these moments. It's about who represents this, who this uplifts, whose stories are being told. And so it's important that we do tell our stories. And so getting to your part of the question about how can we stand up to this? How can we testify at the Capitol? Well, it's all about storytelling. Journalists, student journalists already have these skills. We just have to show up. It all starts by just showing up. I was the only student in the school board room whenever I first spoke against the internet filter and book bans. And never again was I alone because we brought so many students together. We packed those board meetings. It all just took one person showing up. We can all show up together. And on the note about stories, we are the experts of our lived experiences in our classrooms, in our schools. And so while y'all may be journalists capturing other people's stories, illuminating your school communities to different perspectives and realities, you also can't forget about your own stories. And that can be from the perspective of being a student journalist. And so showing up as New Voices Texas to the Capitol, advocating for legislation, building relationships with lawmakers, it's exactly the kind of methods that we use at SEAT. We're telling stories, and that can be through testimony at school board meetings and at committee hearings at the legislature. It can also mean by our student-designed zine, our 32-page zine. We produced 1,000 copies of these and are circulating them this year, telling the story about student advocacy in Texas. That, in ourselves, we operated like a newsroom. We designed this, we told these stories, and we're responding into meeting the moment and meeting students where they are at. And it's a creative act. You're talking about theater. I'm talking about even in Texas, seeing that theater performances at schools have been censored because of the topics or the people playing in certain roles. And we are also responding through art by co-producing puppet shows about different issues in Texas. And that also reminds me that there's this incredible play called Speech and Debate. Not sure if anyone has watched it, but my undergrad university, the students there produced a show of Speech and Debate, which tells a story about student journalism through censorship. And so just illuminating the world through art to these issues engages people. And so it all just starts about being yourself and showing up as yourself and tapping into different things. It doesn't mean you have to be a lawyer. It doesn't mean that you have to be an artist, but you can bring these things together and you can show up as you are. And it just takes one person.
Wow, I just want to say that was very empowering. And so I want to ask, as a follow-up question, you're the executive director for SEATS. How can student journalists be involved with SEATS, and what difference are they making in SEAT them?
Yeah, so we were talking before about local journalism dying out across the country, how students might be the only people writing these stories in their communities, and that is so critical. We need that. We need to document this moment in time, and that's why we produced our zine, because we wanted to tell a story, what's going on for the history books. We needed to be able to capture this moment. That's why we are also doing an oral history project where students are interviewing other students so we can produce profiles of student advocates. And so how can student journalists be involved? I mean, we can see why it's important, why we need to be involved. But then, joining an event is exactly how you can get started. Tapping into our workspace, getting very specific, we have a network of almost 400 students across Texas who are sharing different opportunities with each other because many of them represent different clubs or initiatives or leadership positions that they do beyond SEAT. So we're just convening these students together. And so many students from New Voices attended our advocacy day at the Texas Capitol last year. We had over 300 students at the Capitol learning about different issues and skills for advocacy. And we're going to be doing our advocacy day again this year in April in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, convening over 300 students again. And so we are excited for that. And that's something that students can participate in. Students have gotten internships with lawmaker offices from that. Students have built relationships with policy professionals and lawyers and educators, faculty, to do future events and actions and speaking engagements where they're able to share their voice. Students have talked with journalists at these events or been student journalists themselves writing stories about the other students there. So there's so many different opportunities to channel your voice there. And so at SEAT, we definitely welcome any students who want to be part of it. And we hope that you can bring what you're already doing to the table. So then that means we can learn from you and you can teach other students. And then you can also take up these different opportunities that we're creating because we want to streamline access to democracy. We want to build bridges and break barriers so every student has a seat at the table.
And as for me, I'll definitely be looking forward to joining. And now moving on to Pooja Sai, as our state organizing officer, how can students from different districts support each other when censorship happens?
This might be like a really simple answer, but it's generally just kind of talking with other students, kind of like talking about your own experience, letting them share their own experience back with you. Because I remember when, our publication went under prior review, it was a really lonely, scary kind of experience, especially because it was my story that kind of put our publication under prior review. So kind of knowing that, okay, it was my piece that kind of created this entire like fiasco at our publication. There's just a lot of complicated feelings that went along with it. And also, like my own publication too, when that happened, it was only our second year that that publication was like founded. Just knowing that it just happened so like newly, and the way that our like principal told us, like he was calling a bunch of us just bad journalists for getting it published. He was using those intimidation tactics. Like I remember that I went into a meeting alone, which you probably shouldn't do, but I went into it alone, and I was met with officials from like the district. I was met with like my school counselor. I was met with like another AP, when in my view I walked in thinking, oh, it was just going to be a meeting between me and my own principal. But I think the biggest thing really is kind of just talking with one another. That's like a really big support system. I did, when this all everything happened, like we did have conversations in our newsroom about it, but it was just so new. Like, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know the stakes of censorship until it really happens to you. I mean, that's what happened to me. I was introduced to like New Voices, like Hazelwood, in like my sophomore year when I did first get involved with journalism. But I didn't really think much about it because a lot of people are like, well, that's not going to happen to me. But kind of like when you do talk with these other students and when it does happen to you, you see how it's so unfortunately very prevalent, kind of happens more than you think it does. So yeah, just kind of talking to people. I remember I was on a Zoom call with Grayson too, and I was telling him about everything that was happening, and like just kind of like being able to express how you're feeling, being able to express, oh, this is what I'm thinking about, this is what I'm thinking about doing. It just kind of soothes you too, kind of like understanding, hey, you're not alone in this. Like there's other people that are like alongside you fighting with this. And also it helps other student journalists get ideas too. I remember I had a friend who I think she was from New Jersey, and she reached out to me. She was like, "Hey, I know you're involved in this stuff, and I know we're like states away from one another, but do you think I could just talk to you about it? Like I feel like you would be the only one who would really understand about, having their piece be the reason that their publication is in the situation that they're in." Kind of just being that like listening ear, it just provides more support than you might think it does.
Yeah, and one more follow-up question to that. What would you do differently if you could go back to your first censorship experience knowing what you do now?
I think that's a tough one. I think, what would I do differently? I think I would kind of just put on a more braver face. I think like I like when the entire thing happened, I get it, like being scared is like it happens to everyone, but kind of reminding yourself that like, hey, you are an ethical student journalist. When this entire situation happened, it was kind of it just hit a lot at like me as a journalist. It was just like, oh, am I really a bad journalist? Am I someone who like is just terrible at what I do? Like did I actually like harm our like community? Did I like, like all these like I like all of these like ideas like started like coming into my head. But at the end of the day, no, like remind yourself you're not a bad student journalist. You're learning. You're like, don't really listen to your administration because they do enforce those intimidation tactics. At least in my case, they did. And like they unfortunately do make you feel bad about yourself while really like you're a student journalist. You're doing journalism. Like you're not supposed to be PR for your school. You're supposed to, do these stories that are important for the community, that are important for the school, for the students, for the staff. And sometimes not all stories are, well, positive stories, not all of, sometimes some stories do take hits on like systems that are put in place that are hurting students. And if we're not trying to shed bad light in the district, we're trying to tell the truth. And if I like to always think to myself, if the district is really having a problem about how we're feeling about a certain issue, I think the district should change it. Like I feel like that's just like a little just like a little thing. But yeah, I mean, kind of just remember that you're not alone, really reach out to your friends, reach out to SPLC. But yeah.
Thank you. Trisha, do you want to?
I mean, yeah, I kind of wanted to add on too, as another example of like Pujus I was talking about, just talking to like other people who have faced censorship. For example, Pujus and I, during the Fall Fiesta, actually, after we presented our New Voices presentation, we met with a few student journalists from Texas that were facing censorship actively. And we were just kind of talking of like what to do. They were talking about like, how they felt censored, and that was kind of like a bonding thing for us, and it helped them feel like less alone. So it definitely can help, and those student journalists, they felt more prepared to face administration, I feel. But yeah, I think she froze. But I think that those are all the questions that we had for our panelists. We were going to move on to like if anyone had any questions to put in the Q&A box, but I don't see any right now. So instead, what I wanted to do was I wanted to like see if any panelists or just anyone had any personal stories of censorship that you really think impacted like your advocacy or like your view on censorship. But if any panelists had any stories like that.
I can talk a little bit. So, for some background, I was a high school student journalist in New York. New York is not one of our 18 states that has a New Voices law, although a lot of people are very surprised by that. And at the time, there were a lot of unfortunate things happening in my school, but we weren't really allowed to publish them. Instead, we were covering stories about our basketball team losing again or the recent assembly we had. And as a result, I actually ended up quitting my newspaper as a high schooler. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy being told what I could and couldn't write about, especially stories that I thought were really important for the school community to hear about, to heal from some of the events that had transpired, and just to come together as a school community. I ended up going into college and still studying journalism, still very passionate about this field, obviously, trying to protect it vehemently. And that's when I found SPLC, and that's how I got involved to this day. I didn't know about it as a high schooler. I wish I had. I probably would have done a lot of different things if I had known about SPLC at the time. But really, what inspires me or has shifted me to continue fighting against administrative censorship has been you guys as student journalists. You guys tell your stories. They continue to inspire me to know that there are students braver than I was when I was a high school student. I wouldn't have been brave enough to go to my principal or go to my state legislature or do anything like that. I rarely was that engaged in advocacy at that age. So seeing everyone here and also all over the country continue to fight back, continue to push for new voices has been really inspiring and keeps me going.
Yeah, that honestly sounds similar to like I want to share a censorship story that I had earlier this year, two actually, but the first one, me and my friend, we wanted to write about the Ten Commandments. Like now you have to post it in every classroom. And so we were thinking, okay, let's ask like a few unbiased questions. I emailed my principal at the time, and she forwarded that email to her secretary, in which I didn't get a response back. So a week later, I followed up with like the same questions. I like a lot of different administration got involved because I think they were just passing those like Ten Commandments questions to like other different people, and eventually I got a response Not to me, but my advisor. And they were saying, my questions were too confrontational, but I appreciate your enthusiasm. Basically, what they said to me. In my opinion, I wasn't asking anything, confrontational. I was asking unbiased questions on like who donated the posters, what are the specific like laws around it. But yeah, I didn't end up getting any like questions answered from administration. Instead, I only got them from teachers. But in a way, I was like, I feel like that was a form of censorship, not getting that email to my advisor. But another censorship, which was a lot more recent, is there's been ICE student walkouts throughout Texas high schools. And there was one planned in our school for Prosper High School, like in a week. And so the editorial board decided that we wanted to cover it. And then that's when our administration heard about it and they told us, okay, you can't do that because I think TEA like posted an announcement saying if schools do this, they'll get their funding cut. And so we weren't able to do that. I think a lot of high school journalists across Texas weren't able to cover it. But yeah, that was my most recent censorship.
I was making a face when you asked this question because I'm like, oh gosh, which story do I even tell? Because I've been at three different districts in my teaching career, and I've had great administrators and not great administrators. And by not great, I mean I do want to preface this by saying administrators don't get trained on this. Like they at most, because I've actually my father's an administrator. I looked at the textbook that they used for their class on overall school law, okay? And I mean, they give a couple of pages to tinker, and then basically they give half a page to Hazelwood and say, oh, yeah, there was this case. Here's what happened. And it says you can censor. And I mean, sure, I'm paraphrasing, but you can't really get into that legitimate educational issue in half a page, which is what that Hazelwood standard is. So I do, with age, kind of try and sympathize that, maybe when they're dealing with pushback from parents or something, that they don't know the law, and they don't know the law like probably like you do, because hopefully your advisors go over it in J1 and at the beginning of the year. So let me start off by saying that. But it's funny that Grayson mentioned his experience because at my very first campus, when we had gotten a new principal in, this is around the time that students were starting to push back for standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. And there's actually a case that made the news in my current district about this. And I had a student on staff who is a Jehovah's Witness who wanted to write about, like, look, there are multiple reasons that you may see students not doing this. And it doesn't mean that we hate the country or anything like that. It's just, it could be a political point. It could be, supporting our faith. And, he included a call to action in the editorial or not the editorial, the opinion piece, and basically saying, like, adults just need to respect that we have reasons for this. And the principal wanted him to take that out. And I said, well, I mean, I can coach him on it, but, I can't order him to take it out. You haven't really given me an educational purpose. And she said, well, I can talk to him if you won't. And I said, why? And she said, like you can't order him. She said, well, what's the point of this as in prior review if I can't tell students what they can and can't say? And so that's kind of when I had one of those like cringe moments of, okay, well, we've got to have a talk here about what this actually is for. It's not to be a PR piece. It is, this whole prior review thing is for you to check and see if there's a legitimate educational purpose or if, we're inciting violence or something. So yeah, that was one of my experiences as an advisor.
Yeah. We actually had a question. Someone wrote, let me see if I can answer it live. Oh, wait. I don't know. I just pressed enter live. I don't know what that means. But it says, how can students get involved in the fight for student press rights in Texas? How do I get started with New Voices Texas? So, I mean, I can answer some of that. So, to get involved with New Voices Texas, in my opinion, the best thing would be starting a club. I'm the club development officer, and so my job is to give resources for starting clubs. I made an updated club starter kit, which here I put that in the chat. I made an updated club starter kit, and this is basically the best way to like get involved with other student publications. And if you've been censored yourself, you'll get more access to resources. You'll be able to connect or maybe like talk about censorship with non-student journalists, because oftentimes it feels like student journalists are like in our own little bubble of censorship, but in reality I feel like we can talk to non-student journalists about it and see like what they think or like how they can help with it. And I think also too, by starting a club you can build a better relationship with your administration in the case that it gets approved in the first place. But I feel like a big part of student censorship is also like we don't want administration to think like we're the bad guys, like us student journalists are like the enemies in the situation, which we're not. We want to work better with administration, and I think this club may help with that.
And I also want to add on to the question. She already touched on this of how students could get involved in the fight for press rights in Texas, but you could start by joining, by making yourself aware of what's going on, whether it's politically or for other reasons, but just making yourself aware and understanding the cause that you're joining, and then coming to New Voices Texas and participating, whether it's as an officer or as a volunteer. Those are just great ways to be part of New Voices Texas. And so in a few months, we're going to be having a Zoom meeting for anybody interested in joining. And so there is your opportunity to come and join us.
Yeah, I feel like the
And
main thing is just since this isn't a legislative year, 2026, the main thing is educate yourself for when you actually will be on the front lines if you choose to be. I think like education is the most powerful tool because then you're showing, okay, I'm knowledgeable. Like this isn't just like, oh, this is my feelings. These are like facts, you know?
I can add on to this too, but I think, you don't have to be just a New Voices Texas officer to like be involved with the cause. I think another way you guys can get involved, and something that I did too, was I took the step to kind of look into my school board policy and see do we have any protections as student journalists that has been written in the policy? Because when my publication was under prior review, the reason I would keep getting is this is from the district says we have to prior review. And as a journalist, I'm skeptical. I was like, are you being for real, or are you just saying something to like shut me up? So, I took the step forward to read my district's, like, I think it was called like the board policy manual or something. And I'm pretty sure every school district has something like that. And, just put in like keywords like Hazelwood or coal miner or student journalist or, something of such sorts, and see what is the language being used in the manual. And I mean, for my district, it was like copy and paste Hazelwood coal miner, like court decision and everything. Like, so it did say that it was up to the school what they wanted to do with school sponsored publications. And I know that SPLC has some guidelines, not guidelines, like a model policy that, you could help advocate for in your school board. Like I tried doing that. I mean, it didn't go very well, but I mean, I tried, and kind of just asking, just kind of confronting your board, your school board, and saying, hey, what you have right now in the manual it doesn't protect student journalists. It's like if something did happen, you're not protecting me. So kind of taking those steps forward and kind of just talking with other student media around like the district too, because sometimes like for my school anyway, we were being told one thing and then another school was being told another thing. So it was kind of like there wasn't like the same dialogue being used. So getting a better understanding of like how does my student media work at my school, but what about another student media in like these other schools too? But yeah.
We actually have another question. How do we actually get a New Voices law passed in Texas? This might be more legal stuff.
As I shared a little bit, you have to get a bit lucky. Something we always say is a law passes with a bit of magic. We never really are 100% certain when or where something's going to pass. One of our most recent bills in West Virginia, we were actually sure the entire time it wouldn't pass, but it actually eventually did in 2023. Law took 3 years to pass. As I shared earlier, New York is not currently a New Voices state, and we are on our 9th year advocating for the bill here. So sometimes these things do just take time, and you have to be a little bit patient, but also persistent. You have to keep pushing for it and keep returning year after year. Again, Texas is unique. You only get every other year. So in those off years, you have to have things like this, engaging with students, continuing to share stories, continuing to show that this is an issue. This is something that is happening in Texas. This is something that is detrimental to everyone in Texas, whether you're a student journalist or not, and that there's a really easy, simple solution in the New Voices law. And eventually, after sometimes years of advocacy, a law will be passed. But I do also want to share that a law is just the beginning. Once we do have a law passed, you do have those rights and you should freely be able to use them. But know that your school districts are likely still to have bad policies. You're still going to have to do some advocacy and some education. Cameron said earlier, know your rights. That's the best way to protect them. But also, you might have to educate your administrators. As Andrea said, they don't really learn a lot of these things. And that doesn't really change when a new law gets passed. So be persistent, continue coming back every year, continue sharing the stories that are important to you and your school communities, and start early. So hopefully we can get a sponsor early this session, even before the session begins, so we can hit the ground running, as we only have a couple months when the actual Texas legislature is in session.
Piggybacking off something that Grayson just said, yeah, passing the law is just the first step, because in a lot of states, for instance, you mentioned West Virginia, they didn't give a timeline for these school districts to adopt policies that were in compliance with the law. It says they had to, but didn't say how long it had to, there are plenty that still don't have one. There's not really a clear penalty for what happens if they don't put it into place. A lot of states, and I'm willing to bet every single one of us who works in a school district in Texas, they probably are buying their board policies from TASB. And, a lot of other states have their version of that. And sometimes TASB will push, not TASB in this case, but other states will push out board policy updates that aren't necessarily fully 100% compliant with their state's New Voices law. So you definitely, once a law gets passed, you have to do the groundwork to make sure your district's following through. It's not just an automatic done deal.
Yeah, and so just to add on, as the legislative officer, I definitely agree with what you said, Grayson. Advocacy is the best way to help get a law passed. Advocacy and just understanding it in general. And to address what Mr. Dower said in the chat, for looking up your state representative, clicking on that link, capital.texas.gov/home, you can put in your address, your city, and then your zip code, and then you should be able to find who your state representative is to be able to contact them and ask them very important questions. And I don't think that we have any more questions in the Q&A, so I think that might be it. Trisha, unless you had anything else you wanted to add?
The only thing is, I guess it's just reiterating the point, but yeah, inform your administration. I feel like there's often a gap between the student publications and their administration. Inform them, and while you're doing that, form a relationship with your administration. Let them know that you have the common goal in mind, is to better the school community, and this is our way of doing it. Let them know that we're not the enemy, and I feel like just understanding will help too with censorship. But yeah.
Before we go, just remember, lawmakers need to hear from you. So please follow New Voices Texas on Instagram and find your representative using the link that was just aforementioned in the chat, and tell them why student press freedom really matters. I just want to say thank you to our panelists and to SPLC and JEA. Let's keep on telling the stories that matter, and thank you guys so much for joining.
Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join.